The Philadelphia Eagles officially reported for training camp today, with practices scheduled to take place from tomorrow onwards over the next 4 weeks. If you didn't see yesterday's video where we broke down just about everything you need to know about this Eagles offense, it will be listed down in the description. But in case you have, and you're practically salivating over the idea of as much Eagles content as possible, then this is the video for you. Today we take a look at the other side of the ball, the positional battles, the underdogs, the wild cards, and the players that you need to be watching over the course of the next 4 weeks. Who will make the roster? Who could be surprisingly cut? We're going to take a look at all of that and so much more in today's video. So before we get into it though, guys, make sure if you do enjoy this sort of content that you leave a like and hit that big red subscribe button. But most importantly, drop your opinions down below. Who are the players you want to see? What are the positions that you'll be focusing on and taking notes on as we get towards preseason? And as always, if you want as much Philadelphia sports content as possible, you can check out my website phillysportsnetwork.com for content from myself and all of our sports writers. This team was built from the ball out, so it's only fair that we start inside the trenches and more specifically at defensive tackle, and it's a position that has seen much rejuvenation over the last few months. Defensive tackle was a prominent need from the moment the Eagles playoff run came to a heartbreaking end against the New Orleans Saints. Fletcher Cox posted a career high in sacks, but did so without much in the way of a supporting cast, and as a result had to be on the field for 79% of defensive snaps. Now, Michael Bennett played a huge role as someone that could line up at the 3-tech spot, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but in 2017, Bo Allen and Destiny Vying combined to play in over 60% of defensive snaps, and that was with a healthy Timmy Jernigan in the fray. There was no interior push behind the starters with Jernigan injured last year, and that was something the Eagles absolutely had to rectify, and they did. Free agent defensive tackle Malik Jackson was signed to a 3-year, $30 million contract, and that was a huge move for the Eagles, finally giving Fletcher Cox a running mate once again, and someone that in his prime at the age of 29 has experience playing both inside and outside, the perfect hybrid replacement for arguably Bennett and at the time Timmy Jernigan. In the last 3 years for Jacksonville, he started 42 games, accumulating 105 tackles and 18 sacks on his continued rise to become one of the league's best at his position. The 6'5", 290-pound pass rusher wasn't the only addition though. The Eagles also brought back Timmy Jernigan, who at one point threatened to pull a Talvin despite signing a contract with the team, which is bizarre in its own right, but Jernigan clearly playing with a chip on his shoulder is good news for the Eagles. After suffering a herniated disc that forced him to miss most of the 2018 season, where he appeared in only 3 games and tallying 2 tackles, it's safe to say he won't be resuming that role of the entrenched starter he had that year beforehand, and instead will likely be taking on a rotational role as a DT3, but it's the DT4 role that arguably brings the most intrigue, and as of right now, that spot is being held by Hassan Ridgeway, who was acquired on the final day of the 2019 NFL Draft. The 24-year-old was originally a 4th round pick back in 2016, and since then has played 34 games, notching 41 tackles, 6 tackles for a loss, and 4.5 sacks. It's rare to get instant impact out of a 7th round selection, and the Eagles knew that going into the final round, so instead they traded away that pick for a player that has already proven himself at the NFL level, and the real potential of this move comes down to development. He was drafted into a 3-4 scheme, which many thought wasn't quite the best fit, but at 6'3", 305 pounds, he was never really that space-eating mauler. His athleticism lent itself to being a more efficient pass rusher, as evidenced by his preseason traction, where he amassed 4 sacks in 2 games, and it's not like that's new. So if we're looking at DT4, you've got a guy that can come in instantly, is produced at the NFL level, and has quite the credible resume despite being only 24 years old, giving the Eagles some much needed serenity at that rotational spot. But what about the guys a bit further down the pecking order? There are players like Trayvon Hester, who made some substantial contributions on special teams and flashed when handed defensive opportunity as well. And then there are players like Bruce Hector, a little bit further down that pecking order, who maybe didn't quite show enough despite given some more opportunity. So I would say Hester has the advantage going in, is probably the most likely to snatch a spot away from those guys, but the one player I'm really intrigued about here is Anthony Rush, an undrafted free agent agent out of UAB. He has a ridiculously intimidating frame at 6'5", 350 pounds, and yes, he may be a small school sleeper, but if you look at the way the Chargers utilised Brandon Mebane last year as a space-eating guy who can swallow up double teams and allow those edge rushers to feast, I think you can see a nice niche role there for Rush to carve into and really make an impact in those NASCAR packages if you just field an extra defensive tackle. But that will be my wild card to keep an eye on, is Anthony Rush. A little bit further outside lie the defensive ends, and this has been a topic of real discussion all season long for the Eagles. Now, they brought back Brandon Graham, which in itself was a huge move. It's a 3-year extension and one that probably comes a little bit later than it should have done, but it saved the Eagles money, and at the end of the day it's a business, so what can you expect? After a 9.5 sack campaign in 2017, many assumed the Eagles would strike while the iron was hot, but they didn't. Graham has been an instrumental piece of this defense and has long deserved that new contract. Graham has always wanted to remain in Philadelphia, and being able to keep the 30-year-old who has been nothing but productive in each and every year is one thing, but being able to do so and set the market as opposed to losing him is something else completely, and hats off to Howie on that front. But this move in itself was vital, because without it we'd be having a very different discussion. The pressure is on for 2017 first round pick Derek Barnett this year as he enters year number 3 with some lofty expectations on his shoulders. Of course, he's still rehabbing an injury at the minute that cut short his second campaign in the NFL, and prior to the injury Barnett was productive, but in PFF's pressure category he ranked 46th as a rookie and dropped 5 spots as a sophomore. So there are some concerns about Barnett's play. I've always found him to be very flashy, very explosive, but deep into drives he can disappear sometimes, and that can hurt the team. But it's also easy to forget he's just 23 years old. But now there's pressure to fill a gaping hole in production that was lost in the way of Chris Long and Michael Bennett, more on that in just a second, and pressure to live up to those first round lofty expectations, pressure to be the guy. Now, Barnett certainly has the skill set and the potential to evolve into that pass rusher, but will he be able to do so at the rate in which the Eagles need him to? He played in 7 games before a torn rotator cuff ended 2018, but he still recorded 17 tackles and 2.5 sacks in almost half the snaps he played last year, so there's certainly a jump in development to come. And as mentioned before, that's needed. The Eagles lost Chris Long, who played in 58% of snaps last year, and they also lost Michael Bennett, who has the most quarterback pressures of any edge rusher since 2014. He had 37 last season to go with 20 hits according to Pro Football Focus, while Chris Long hit the quarterback on 3.3% of snaps, a number that rivals some of the best edge rushers in this league. Now, the Eagles did bring back Vinny Curry, which certainly negates some of that problem, but beneath that things get murky. As of right now, you're going to be looking to guys like Josh Sweat to step up, a 4th round pick who, as a rookie, really didn't show much. The coaching staff didn't trust him in situations other than blowouts to come in and sweep up. That was worrying, especially considering the injury setbacks that they had. Then you've got Sharif Miller, the Penn State rookie, who was also drafted in the 4th round of this year's draft, but brings what is right now quite a one-dimensional skill set. If he can't win with a bull rush, he doesn't have any other weapons at his disposal, and that's got to be a focus at training camp. So keep a real eye out on Sharif Miller. He's got every athletic trait you could want, but he doesn't yet have that wealth of experience and moves to his game to make him a real dominant force at the next level, and that's expected with a 4th round pick. But can the Eagles coaching staff, can his fellow defensive ends really instill some of those into his game before week 1 of the regular season? If you ask me, there is a very, very good chance that one of those guys could end up stashed on IR. I'd presume it to be Josh Sweat based off his injury history, or maybe even, just maybe, risk the practice squad. Now, I say that because there seems to be a pending agreement with Connor Barwin that in a couple of weeks, Howie Roseman and Barwin will examine the situation and see if the Eagles need that extra help. And as of right now, I would jump at the chance to bring him on as an edge 4 guy that will come in, maybe play 30 to 40% of snaps and take that pressure off. He's currently working out and bulking to play the role of a 4-3 defensive end. He played a rotational role in New York. It will be emulated in Philadelphia, and it makes sense as a culture guy, as a leader, as someone that can help those younger guys learn. There's plenty of them. Because below Sweat and Miller, both of whom have their own concerns if dropped into a game in a clutch situation, you've then got Joe Ostman, who was a scout team star for the coaching staff last year, but is now going to take a sizable step up to prove he can cut on to the end of that 53-man roster. And if he can't, that's a very different discussion, and the Eagles are lacking defensive ends. So it's all about that DE4. Do they trust Josh Sweat and Sharif Miller enough to get out there and make plays, or will they need a veteran presence? And it's that very debate where the futures of guys like Deshaun Hall and Joe Osman really hang in the balance. On to linebacker, and the Eagles did a good job of replacing the loss of Jordan Hicks. The signing of Zach Brown may well be one of the most underrated of the entire offseason, but it didn't stop there. Paul Warrilow also signed a new deal after missing all of what would have been his 1 year in Philadelphia due to an ACL tear, so he's back with a slight vengeance as well, and they of course joined Nigel Bradham. Because the Eagles lean so heavily on those nickel formations that there are often only 2 out on the field, which means that those battles become even more intense. So Camu Grugier-Hill, who's become a special teams ace, leading the team in tackles in that category for the last 2 years, will now likely be battling head on with a guy like LJ Fort, another special team standout who joins the team as a free agent and came off a quite productive stint in Pittsburgh. Former Nebraska safety Nate Jerry is very much built in that same vein as Malcolm Jenkins, and that's where he's really developed over these last couple of years, so keeping an eye on his development is going to be really fun as well. But the one linebacker I'm really keying in on this offseason is Alex Singleton, the former Calgary Stampeder, another CFL standout. Named a Canadian Football League All-Star in both of his last 2 seasons, he was also given the CFL's Most Outstanding Defensive Player Award in 2017, leading the league in tackles 1 year later. A 6'2", 232-pound Singleton bounced around NFL practice squads before landing in Calgary, where in 3 seasons he has over 300 tackles to his name. But why does his signing matter? Well, the CFL field is wider than an NFL field, which means that off-field linebackers naturally have further to travel, and with the nature of players being able to motion before the snap, the reliance on that sideline to sideline speed is even more important. While also showing up as a special teams ace, we know there's a focus on offenses using the width of the field as opposed to the length of it. So maybe, just maybe, the Eagles are trying to find a secret weapon to groom on a practice squad in the background that could climb up the special teams ladders and one day try and cut out those pesky screen passes and all of the pre-snap motions that are suddenly translating into the NFL. That would be my player to keep an eye on, guys. Alex Singleton had a strong OTAs. Keep an eye out for him this summer. Next up is one of the most hotly anticipated battles on the entire roster. It's the cornerback position, and it comes with so much in the way of intrigue. As of right now, Ronald Darby, Sidney Jones and Jalen Mills are all coming off of season-ending injuries, and that paved the way for 2 very strong OTA performances from the likes of Avonte Maddox and Rasul Douglas. Now, I could spend literally hours diving into hypotheticals and people who could win or lose roster battles, but the one thing that I think stands out here is that Jalen Mills does not necessarily have a lock on that CB2 role. Now, yes, he's been the starter for quite some time, but the Eagles need to get their best corners on the field, and I would argue that both Douglas and Maddox have made a real statement that they deserve that role. As for the nickel, I think unless Sidney Jones moves outside, that's kind of his for now, and Ronald Darby will remain CB1. The wild card here is if Avonte Maddox moves to safety and is comfortable enough. Now, a report came out recently, we cited it on PhillySportsNetwork.com, essentially stating that Tim Houck, the safeties coach, wants to try Maddox at safety, see how he gets on, and they'll make a decision whether to move him there permanently by the end of preseason. Now, if that happens, that would obviously coincide with the decision to potentially cut Andrew Sendejo, who was signed earlier this offseason, and recoup a 4th round pick. Now, that not only gets some extra draft capital, but it means that they get one of their best defensive backs on the field, and at this point, with such a young and loaded secondary, you want to get as many of your top guys on the field as humanly possible, and that's where the fun of training camp comes in. Now, it's also been reported that Ronald Darby will start and are physically unable to perform this, which will again open up CB1 opportunities, Saul Douglas, Avonte Maddox, and maybe even a bump up for Cravon LeBlanc and Sidney Jones. This is going to be crazy. The fact that all 3 starters are returning from injury, they may not be able to handle a workload so early on, and that is going to give even more opportunity to guys who are already making the most of it. I cannot wait to see how this pans out. If there's one guy to really watch, I think Rasul Douglas is a shoo-in to take that CB2 role. I've been preaching for months that Maddox will likely move to safety. I think that's going to be an eventuality, but the main underdog to keep note of off here is Jay Liggins. I spoke to Liggins earlier in the offseason. The undrafted free agent out of Dickinson State signed with the Eagles after playing in 43 games, getting 151 tackles. How in the first round of the NAIA Championship Series, he had 4 interceptions alone and has 13 career picks to his name. And when you partner that with a 6'3" frame, the guy is an absolute ball hawk and have many scouts salivating. So that's going to be the guy to watch as training camp progresses. Finally, we've made it to the safety position where Malcolm Jenkins still hasn't been given the contract extension he deserves. Maybe that will happen during training camp, maybe it won't, but he's not letting it stand in the way between himself and the team. So Jenkins attends camp, Rodney McLeod is coming back from injury, and now beneath them, that's where things get interesting. As we know about this Eagles defense, Jenkins spends a lot of his time in the box and lining up elsewhere along the defense, sort of like a remote controlled missile, while Rodney McLeod holds the fort over the top with a combination of 2 or 3 other safeties beneath him. Now it's those safeties where the fun begins. We've mentioned Sendejo and the possibility of Avonte Maddox maybe moving up and taking that role, and that is probably one of the most likely outcomes as training camp looms. But there are other names to consider. Blake Countess was a former 6th round pick of the Eagles before going to the Rams and emerging as a real special teams ace there. He comes back with some defensive experience and a lot of special teams power to his name. Watch out for him to be in the thick of that action. And then there's a guy like Trey Sullivan, who's got better and better every season he's spent with the Eagles and will likely want to put his hat into the mix as well. Meanwhile, DeAndre Hall brings intriguing size at 6'2", 206 pounds, and Trey Elston was signed while Malcolm Jenkins was absent from the early stages of OTA. So those are 2 guys who are scrapping it out down towards the bottom of the roster. But that brings us to the end of this video. The entire roster has been covered over the last 2 days. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this. All of the support really does mean the world to me. It would be great if you could hit that subscribe button, and again, drop your comments down below. Let me know who you're looking forward to watching over the course of the summer. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at LiamJenkinsPSN. PhillySportsNetwork.com is the place to catch all of our content over the next 4 weeks, but you can expect so much in the way of training camp coverage, so buckle up, strap yourselves in, football season is back.